There is a peculiar sickness in American culture today. The canonization of ignorance, the sanctification of half-baked opinions, the worship of confusion masquerading as wisdom. It is the notion that simply being open-minded is a virtue, even if it means your skull has become a wide-open barn door through which every passing absurdity strolls unchallenged. And at the very center of this temple of unreason sits Joseph James Rogan, high priest of the cult of I'm just asking questions, a man who, by some ghastly accident of timing and algorithms, has managed to turn wide-eyed credulity into a multi-million-dollar franchise. Consider the resume. Once upon a time, he was the carnival barker who persuaded contestants to munch on bugs and swallow farmyard fluids for television ratings. Now that same figure is hailed as one of the most influential voices in the Republic. The absurdity would be laughable were it not so emblematic of a larger collapse of cultural standards. For this is not a philosopher king, but a man who gives the solemn weight of metaphysics to questions such as, have you ever tried DMT? He welcomes quacks and scholars alike, nodding along with the same stoned reverence. Whether his guest is an actual epidemiologist or a grifter peddling nonsense about lost Atlantean empires, the formula is simple and devastating. Invite on voices from the fringe, grant them a stage that dwarfs universities and newspapers, decline to challenge their assertions with even the most basic scrutiny, and punctuate the sermon with a vacant, whoa, that's wild. When called out for laundering lunacy into the mainstream, retreat to the coward's defense of free speech, as though every incoherent ramble deserves parity with knowledge earned by study, testing, and evidence. In Rogan's cosmos, a crackpot YouTube rant is granted the same dignity as a peer-reviewed paper. That is not skepticism. That is the commodification of stupidity. Take Alex Jones, a man whose fantasies about secret cabals and satanic elites helped spawn real-world violence. To Rogan, he is not a menace but an amusing eccentric with funny stories. When Graham Hancock insists without evidence that ancient astronauts built our monuments, Rogan leans in like a disciple, handing him more attention than serious archaeologists could dream of. When Jordan Peterson delivers sprawling sermons about chaos dragons and Western decay, Rogan listens as though he's seated at the feet of Marcus Aurelius, rather than enduring the nervous breakdown of a once-respected psychologist. The COVID debacle deserves special emphasis. Here was Rogan, with no medical background whatsoever, musing aloud about vaccines to millions during the deadliest pandemic in living memory. He downplayed the shots, flirted with conspiracy, touted alternative cures. And when he himself caught the virus, he promptly ingested a chemical cocktail that included a drug better known for deworming livestock, then presented this reckless self-experimentation as though it were a triumph of independent thought. I'm no doctor, he insists, just before distributing medical advice to a listening audience larger than the population of some nations. The damage cannot be quantified, but the method is clear. Elevate anecdotes, dismiss expertise, and label every scientist who objects a shill for Big Pharma. But Rogan is not only a prophet of ignorance, he is also a merchant of a particularly cartoonish masculinity. Here is a man deep into middle age, puffing himself up as the arbiter of what it means to be a real man. Testosterone levels, elk hunting, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, cold plunges, fistfights, supplements. This image of the stoned warrior sage is lapped up by millions of young men who crave identity in a world they don't understand. And behind the tough guy theater lies the con, questioning FDA-approved treatments while simultaneously hawking alpha brain powders and miracle greens. He is suspicious of science only when it isn't paying him a sponsorship fee. As if this weren't enough, we are subjected to his witless defense that he is, after all, merely a comedian. The truth? He ceased to be funny decades ago. His specials are not comedy, but extended barroom grumbles about cancel culture, delivered with the wit of a drunk cousin after Thanksgiving dinner. And yet this excuse, I'm just a comedian, is deployed every time he's accused of mainstreaming extremism. It is the oldest coward's shield. When challenged, claim it was all a joke. When applauded, claim it was bravery. His supposed devotion to free speech is equally fraudulent. He trumpets the sanctity of open dialogue while having Spotify quietly pull episodes when the fire grows too hot. He cries censorship when critics object to the poison on his platform, then happily wields copyright law against those who dissect his content. Free speech for him, but not for thee. The results are catastrophic. Millions of young men are being reared not on critical thinking, but on Rogan's blend of paranoia and pseudo-wisdom. They are learning to mistrust scientists, historians, doctors, anyone whose expertise comes from toil rather than doing your own research on YouTube. To them, the professor with decades in the field is suspect, while the guest on Rogan's couch is authentic. The very idea of knowledge is reduced to a pub conversation, where every wild hunch deserves equal standing with hard-won fact. And let us not forget the economics. Spotify handed him a check in the hundreds of millions, an obscene reward for the endless production line of meandering conversations that pass for insight. Instead of elevating voices of genuine expertise, the platform anointed Rogan as its crown jewel, confirming that in today's marketplace of ideas, it is not truth or reason that triumphs, but sheer engagement, controversy, and the ability to keep listeners glued through the next round of ads. What Rogan has constructed is not a podcast, but a pipeline, a system for rehabilitating broken ideas, for sanding down the rough edges of extremism until it feels like friendly banter, for recasting ignorance as authenticity. He is the smiling doorman at the gateway to the rabbit hole, ushering the disaffected deeper into suspicion, confusion, and lunacy. The true tragedy is not that Joe Rogan exists. Men like him have always existed. The pub philosopher, the stoned mystic, the crank at the corner table convinced he's uncovered the secret history they don't want you to know. The tragedy is that modern technology has catapulted him into a pulpit larger than anything a serious scholar could dream of, and millions have mistaken his shrugging neutrality for courage. He is not speaking truth to power, he is babbling nonsense to the powerless and calling it wisdom. And the cost is the degradation of our cultural ability to distinguish fact from fantasy, evidence from opinion, knowledge from ignorance. That is the Rogan legacy. Not enlightenment, not comedy, not truth-seeking, but the monetization of confusion itself. And if American culture cannot find its way out of this swamp, then Joe Rogan will not be remembered as an outlier, but as the prophet of a civilization that finally decided it preferred delusion to knowledge. There is something uniquely grotesque about the way Joe Rogan has positioned himself as the voice of the average man, as though ordinariness itself were a credential and ignorance a kind of credentialed wisdom, and it is here that one must linger to appreciate the sheer scale of the charade. For Rogan's empire is not merely the world's largest podcast, nor simply a profitable curiosity for Spotify and advertisers, but a cultural factory where mediocrity is polished into authenticity and superstition, is gift-wrapped as skepticism. And what makes it so insidious is not that Rogan ever utters anything particularly profound. He does not. But that millions mistake the very absence of depth for a kind of integrity, a claim that because he is not trained in philosophy, medicine, or history, his ramblings therefore embody an honesty that the elites have supposedly abandoned, when in fact all it demonstrates is that charisma has triumphed over knowledge in the hierarchy of values. His listeners believe him not because he is credible but because he is legible, because he sits across the microphone looking vaguely like the uncle who buys you a beer before you're of age, and nods through 3-hour stretches of rambling, where conspiracy theory and science occupy the same table as though they were equals, and in doing so he blurs the line between entertainment and education, until one is no longer sure whether he is describing a trip on hallucinogens or advising on pandemic policy. And this collapsing of categories, this flattening of discourse into the great swamp of just conversation, is the essence of the Rogan problem. For here is a man who has perfected the art of being wrong without consequence, who deploys the refrain, "I'm just a comedian," as though it were a shield against accountability while simultaneously posturing as a brave truth-teller who dares to question the establishment. A convenient oscillation between buffoon and sage depending on whether he is criticized or applauded. And this very slipperiness makes him harder to pin down because his fans will insist you have mischaracterized him. He's not a journalist, he's not a scientist, he's just Joe. As though the size of his platform were irrelevant, as though tens of millions of downloads a week could be excused as a mere side hobby, rather than one of the most powerful megaphones in contemporary culture. And the hypocrisy of the free speech martyrdom he performs is laid bare in the moment. One notices how swiftly he calls upon Spotify to remove particularly damning episodes, or how readily his legal team weaponizes copyright claims against critics, revealing that his version of open dialogue is not the noble struggle for liberty he pretends it to be, but rather the ancient, selfish demand for one-way speech, a demand that he be free to broadcast any crankery he wishes while critics be constrained to silence. And the supreme irony is that his own ignorance is marketed as humility, his incessant, "I don't know," man mistaken for Socratic wisdom, when in fact it is the performance of ignorance itself that is the product he is selling, the masquerade of a man so open to every possibility that he cannot distinguish between the plausible and the preposterous. Treating Graham Hancock's fairy tales about forgotten civilizations with the same solemnity as a virologist explaining spike proteins, and nodding just as earnestly at Jordan Peterson's Jungian dragons as he does at a bodybuilder hawking protein powders. And if the Rogan phenomenon were confined merely to this carnival of absurdity, it might be dismissed as harmless entertainment. But it metastasizes into something darker precisely because it trains an entire demographic, predominantly young men, to distrust expertise as such, to believe that all institutions are suspect, that the professor who has excavated ruins for 3 decades is compromised, but the guest with a slideshow of pyramids is authentic, that the epidemiologist with years of peer-reviewed work is a shill, but the bro who did his own research on Reddit is heroic. And it is no exaggeration to say that this inversion of values corrodes the very possibility of public reason, for if every opinion is equally valid, then evidence loses its force. Expertise becomes irrelevant and the loudest, most engaging voice always wins, which is precisely why Spotify, in its infinite cynicism, paid hundreds of millions to install Rogan as its flagship. Not because he elevates discourse, but because he monopolizes attention. And attention, in the late capitalist marketplace, is more valuable than truth itself. Thus Rogan becomes not simply a symptom of cultural decline, but an accelerant. A man who, whether stoned in a float tank or red-faced in his studio, projects a counterfeit authenticity that young men mistake for guidance, teaching them that masculinity is a checklist of elk meat and testosterone, that skepticism means rolling your eyes at experts while swallowing supplements from his sponsors, that bravery is sitting in a studio nodding for 3 hours while a guest insists that aliens built the pyramids. And perhaps the most damning thing about it all is that it works, it sells, it influences, it shapes, because his performance of being just one of the guys has been alchemized into a political, cultural, and intellectual force, one that persuades millions to conflate doubt with insight, ignorance with independence, misinformation with free thinking. And the tragedy, the deep, unrelenting tragedy, is that Rogan himself is not even a villain in the classical sense. He is no Machiavelli orchestrating from the shadows, no tyrant with ideological fervor, but rather something worse, something more banal, a man who does not know, does not care that he does not know, and has monetized the very act of not knowing, turning stupidity into spectacle and spectacle into influence, until we arrive at the absurd condition where the most powerful voice in American media is a former game show host who once paid people to drink donkey semen and now presides over the intellectual diet of a generation, and one shudders to imagine what H.L. Mencken or George Orwell would make of such a figure. Though perhaps they would only sigh, for they understood, as we must, that civilization does not collapse with a bang but with a shrug, with the cheerful grin of a man saying, "Wow, that's crazy," man into a microphone, while truth itself drowns beneath the applause of millions who no longer know how to tell the difference.